The Shaping Opinion podcast is brought to you by O'Brien Communications, an independent corporate communications firm. O'Brien Communications helps clients of all sizes with corporate communications and strategic planning, marketing communications, public relations and media relations, content development and writing, and crisis and issues management. Learn more at o'briencommunications.com. Do you ever have a moment in your own life where you step back and say, this reminds me of the Jetsons?
There are moments where I look at things like the iPhone, and I very much feel that Star Trek or the Jetsons to me. I was born in 1974, so half of my life thus far was spent without the internet or all manner of the technology that we have nowadays. And I think that I still have the thrall and the excitement of seeing these new smart technologies like the iPhone. And certainly I look at some of the things that we have and take for granted nowadays and absolutely see it as something that would be in the Jetsons. And indeed, it's an incredible facet of the show that it was very much like Star Trek, prescient in its presentation of technologies that are now, thoroughly domestic.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Danny Graydon. He's an academic, a journalist, and an author who specializes in film and comics. He's also the author of a book entitled The Jetsons, the official guide to the cartoon classic. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Danny about the Jetsons, things you may remember, some things you didn't know, and how a kid's cartoon could shape the way we once thought about the future. On Sunday, September 23, 1962, ABC Television launched its first program ever to be broadcast in color, and that show was The Jetsons. The Jetsons were a children's cartoon broadcast in prime time on Sunday night. At a time when America was engaged in a space race with its archenemy, the Soviet Union, and in the post-war boom, these were the Kennedy years. It was all about optimism for the future. The Jetsons featured a future with flying cars, cities in the sky, robots, spaceships, and the promise of automation. The Jetsons didn't come up with these ideas, but they presented many of them in an entertaining and relatable way. Danny, you wrote a book about the Jetsons that was described as the official guide, as sanctioned by Hanna-Barbera. How did you come to write that book?
Well, I had done a book for Insight Editions in Los Angeles, which was called The Art of Planet 51. This was a European-based animated film that was science fiction-based, which was very, very enjoyable. It was my first book project working with an American publisher. And as a follow-on to that, my editor on that project, a lovely man named Kevin Toyama, said, would you like to do something on the Jetsons? How do you feel about the Jetsons? And I said, I always loved it because I love science fiction. And it was something that I remember from when I was young. And it was this book, which was designed to be an official guide to this cartoon classic. And it was a very, very fun project to write because I had seen repeats of the Jetsons, but it was enabled me to sort of get firmly to grips with the history and the dynamics of it, and also get a sense of the perspective of the society that it represented and was evoking. So it was a very fun little project to do. And since then, I did another book for Insight Editions, which was on the Angry Birds game franchise, but this was the second of them.
Can you tell us more then about your own background? How did you come to specialize in film and comics?
My entire career has been focused on my twin passions of cinema and comic books, specifically with the latter to superheroes. Once I graduated university, I got involved in journalism, which had always been a significant interest of mine in terms of writing about these passions. For 20 odd years, I was a film journalist and a comics journalist, writing for the likes of Empire in the UK, Variety in Los Angeles, and the BBC, and also Amazon, the website. And so I spent a lot of time writing about pop culture, not only just Hollywood cinema, but also comic books, video games, etc. And in the last decade, I moved on from that into academia. I am now a lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire here in Great Britain, where I teach the history and theory relating to model design, special effects, and digital animation. So the 2D animations of the Jetsons and much more besides are very much part and parcel of the things that I teach my students. And this is my 9th year doing that now. But I still write. I still have book projects on the go. I'm currently working on my 8th book, which will be due out in 2019.
What is that book about?
This is a book called Lair. It is photography book about villains' lairs in cinema, but it's done from an architectural perspective. I'm working with an internationally renowned architect to give a perspective on how these locations, these very distinct locations in very famous films, are not only very, very compelling in terms of their designs, but they also have aspirational aspects to them as well. These are places that you want to live in. You know, some of them might be things that you've seen in Bond films, or animations like The Incredibles. But it's a very interesting subject matter that we're going to take a look at from an architectural perspective. So yes, I'm looking forward to doing that. I'm starting that imminently.
That's very interesting, and it actually brings us to our topic today, because we are talking about the Jetsons, but you brought up architecture. And I know from my reading about the Jetsons that architecture actually was a big component of the cartoon and what made it distinctive and possibly the appeal of it. And I guess in a lot of science fiction and comics, the settings are as important as the characters. They're almost characters unto themselves, aren't they?
Very much so. And bearing in mind when the Jetsons began in the early 1960s, you're talking about a period in American history where there was a renewed sense of hope and optimism, which very much came from the likes of President John F. Kennedy. You had the rise of the space race. So even though you had things like the Cold War going on and severe, shall we say, competition and conflict with Russia, what you also had was a sense of the future was coming. And in the Jetsons, you had the reflection of this wonderful Googie architecture, which was a wonderful way to actually give a physical expression to the hopes for the future. So just as the Flintstones, which ultimately the Jetsons is the space age counterpart to that very famous animation, the architecture of the Jetsons gave us a view of a world that to many of us seemed on the horizon, that we might be around to see it. And I think that's one of the reasons why this show is very compelling when it first aired in the 60s, why it remains so when it was revived in the 1980s. But that sort of sense that there would be locations and places that we would live in that would be so startlingly different and able to service us in all kinds of ways. It's very exciting to think about what the future may hold for us and the places that we will exist in.
One of the things that I read was that in the show, they never actually say what year it is when George Jetson is living above in the clouds. But according to their publicity materials and news articles at the time, the show was set 100 years into the future, so that would have made it 2062.
Yes.
So that was the year that they set it. And but one of the first things that I wanted to talk to you about was the number of episodes, because we assumed that was such a popular series that it lasted more than one season. But as I read, it only lasted one season and only had 24 original episodes on ABC. Do you know why?
I think that at the time, I'm not entirely sure exactly why, but what I can say is I think that there was a distinct turnover in terms of animations. And perhaps as well, there is the inference that these shows were not designed to last. They would be seen maybe for like a year or two, and then people's tastes would change. They get excited about new things. I don't think there was that sort of sense of forward thinking that, we'd be seeing syndication down the line, or, what would be happening 30 years from now. I just don't think that there was that sense of forward thinking to it. But one of the interesting things about the Jetsons is that you can actually have a property like this that didn't actually produce a great deal of material, but embedded itself in the pop culture in such a vibrant way. I think that's a testament to the strength of the concept and how entertaining it was, which belies the fact that as a production, it was given up on quite quickly.
Yeah, one of the things that I read, it was in a Smithsonian article that ran on Smithsonian.com in 2012. Well, one of the reasons they speculated that the reason the Jetsons didn't last was because the Jetsons were in color.
Right.
And the show did not look the same in black and white, but most Americans only had black and white TVs at that time. Less than 3% of American homes had color TV sets then. So they said that was a real liability. What have you heard about that?
I can understand that color would have been seen as a liability in terms of the degree of television ownership at that time. And indeed, you can understand from a commercial and a business perspective that if they're spending all this money on making something into glorious color and it's not translating into sales of television sets, then I would see and appreciate the reason why it would not have been carried on beyond a season. So in that way, the show, and I'm sure this happened to many other productions, both live action or indeed animation, that were victims of this. One of the prime examples of a show that changed over in the 1950s from black and white to color was Superman with George Reeves. So that was something that adapted with the times. But I think with the Jetsons, given that the cost of animation was so large, I can understand why it ended quickly.
Why do you think the Jetsons then had such a strong run after that initial season when it started going into syndication?
Well, I think it's because it has a singular appeal. It's very much like the Flintstones, insofar as even though it's got a setting that's way out there in the future, it had similarity to sitcom dynamics. You had a disparate group of characters that was very reminiscent of, indeed, any American family. The problems and the challenges that they were talking about were familiar and amusing. And as a result, because those things are comparatively timeless, it's something that allows the show to get a life beyond its original transmission dates. And that one of those comedic tropes that I think is evergreen is the sitcom. So I think that people also have an interest in retrofuturism. And it's quite interesting to watch the Jetsons and get a glimpse of what people were thinking about back in the early 60s, about what the future was like. There's always a fascinating and very enriching comparison to be had about where we are now and where we thought we might be. When I was researching this book, I had another book that I was given as a child called The Usborne Book of the Future, which was published in 1979. And it spoke about the technologies that we could expect to have by, the mid-1990s. Some of it, like, flat screen televisions and things like that, came about in the following decade. But one of the things about futurism is that there is almost an innate overcompensation. There's an excitement to showing new technologies, but actually society changes at a much slower rate. So even though the Jetsons was 50 odd years ago now, the fact of the matter is that it gives us a window into the ideas and aspirations and optimism of the time, as opposed to being something that is strictly realistic. And as you say, it was set a century into the future. But the truth of the matter is we've seen how fast technology has gone in the last 20 odd years. Who knows what will happen by 2061?
You used the term retrofuturism. Can you describe what that is?
It's a form of futurism that goes back on itself and looks at prior aspects. I mean, I mentioned the book I did before this, which was The Art of Planet 51. The aesthetic of that film, which was produced by Ilion Animation Studios in Madrid, was very much one of the kind of stylized, Googie influenced design that we see in things like Jetsons. The entire aesthetic of that film was like that. So if you've got a sense of futurism, like i.e. ray guns or flying cars, etc., but which have a distinct 50s, early 60s aesthetic to it, then I would say that counts as being retrofuturistic. One step into the future, but with a distinct past aesthetic.
Now let's talk about some of those innovations. And one of the most popular innovations that people think of when they think of the Jetsons is robots and robotics and robot servants.
Yes.
And there was a robot in the show, and I think this illustrates a lot of things about the Jetsons' appeal. The robot had a name, and the name was Rosie the Robot. She was a maid. She was a maid. And she actually only appeared in 2 of the first 24 episodes, but she made an impression. And I think it was this combination of personality, humanity of sorts, and technology and the future. How would you describe where Rosie fit into this whole Jetsons thing?
What Rosie provided, even though, as you say, it was a small glimpse in comparison to the entire run of the show, was a very compelling idea of the growth of technology and how we would interact with it. The idea of there being a maid, someone who supports a family and keeps the day-to-day things running, may seem very, very far-fetched at the time, but I think there's a broader scope to it in the idea that, one day we would have artificial intelligence and machinery in our lives. And I think that unless, of course, you're very rich, there are examples where you actually have robots that are doing this. But we are getting to a place now where we are interacting with technology, with things like the Amazon Alexa. So we are talking to machines in a very casual way. But I think that if you look at science fiction and the way robots are essentially portrayed, which is very often malevolent. I mean, the great example of a decent robot in the 1950s would have been Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet in 1956. So I think there was a sort of setup for this, but the idea that the robot would be in the home and a trusted member of a family, I think that was something that was not scary. It was something that was very compelling and quite a pleasing idea. So I think Rosie's presence, while small, inflamed the imagination of people.
It did, and I think that what it did was, in the way that we grew up with it, even if you were a little kid and you were watching these cartoons on Saturday mornings instead of Sunday night with your family over and over again, you had this feeling that someday these things that are still just imaginary to you will just be the norm. They'll just be routine to you. They won't amaze you anymore. They'll be just something you're used to.
I agree. And I think if you look at the various technologies that are put into the show, you can see there is that, as I said at the beginning, a sense of prescience and a normalcy. As I mentioned, that I have lived through a period where there was that lack of technology, and now that technology is everywhere. And it still surprises me on occasion that the things that I would have seen as being futuristic or completely out of the realms of possibility are now very much part and parcel of my life, which is a wonderfully empowering thing. But having had that perspective of not being with them, I think it's something that I still find quietly thrilling, let's say.
There were some other innovations that they depicted in the Jetsons that actually came to happen over the years. Moving sidewalks, talking alarm clocks, jetpacks, one of the things that Astro used to walk on, a dog treadmill, and flat screen TVs. You mentioned that. And believe it or not, in the very first episode of the Jetsons in 1962, there is a mention of a flat screen TV instead of those old big bulky TVs, and video phones and video screen chats and smartwatches.
Yes.
All of these things have actually come to happen. And they've happened in almost the way that they were depicted in a cartoon in the 1960s. Danny, do you think shows like the Jetsons actually set the bar for people and companies who would later actually develop some of these things? And I'm not talking about just the Jetsons. You could probably lump Star Trek and Star Wars into some of this as well.
I would say that's an absolute certainty. The one thing that we know about Star Trek is that it had a direct influence on young people who got into technology to do this. The famous example is the Motorola StarTAC flip cell phone, which was directly based on its design of a communicator in Star Trek. That's a very, very iconic example of that passage from fiction to reality. But the Jetsons was only a few years before Star Trek. So I think that there was that feeling in the air, as it were, of the progression of technology and the possibilities. And I think that gave inspiration to an entire generation to put that forward. And certainly, when you look at the Jetsons, something as innocuous as a vacuum robot, that exists. Retractable beds, that exists. The idea of video exercise, where George, that was a joke where George was watching himself have exercise. But, we certainly have the opportunity of having videos or DVDs that allow you to exercise along with them. So, to greater and lesser degrees, these small little technological leaps have become an everyday part of our lives. And it's fascinating to look back at these ideas that were pure science fiction at the time and how they just took root in people's imaginations and then became a reality. Science fiction has always been very effective at this futurism of ideas. I mean, a much more recent example of this is a Steven Spielberg film called Minority Report, where Steven Spielberg hired teams of futurists to create a plausible Washington, D.C. of the year 2054, which, interestingly, is not that far off from the purported date of when the Jetsons was set. I'm not saying that the show used teams of futurists, but there were clearly extrapolations of conventional domestic technologies and how they might be if they were fully automated.
It's really fun to look back. It's actually fun to watch some of these episodes of the Jetsons and see what's actually happened since they conceived of some of these ideas at that time. If it wasn't the producers of the Jetsons, it was the futurists, as you said, who were coming up with these ideas. One of the ideas that you see on the Jetsons, George Jetson is actually reading the news on a TV screen in his living room. And there's another case where there's actually, you could call it a drone, because Mr. Spacely, George's boss, he actually uses a little robot that flies around and spies on people to see if they come to work on time. He wants to see if George is coming to work on time. So he has this little drone with a camera on it that tells him whether George is on time or not. And then there's this thing called a peekaboo prober, but George goes to a doctor.
Yes.
And he has to get a physical. So what he does is he swallows this robotic pill called a peekaboo prober, and the prober goes down into his body, and it sends video back to a TV screen so the doctor can see what's going on inside of George's body. And that, to me, is amazing, because when you watch that now and it's just a kid's cartoon, at least that's what you tell yourself, but then you watch that and you think, I can't believe in 1962 they were envisioning that, and I wonder if they really thought that might come to happen.
I think people have broad ideas about what you might be able to do with technology, and then obviously comes the hard part of actually formulating it into what is available at the time. You were talking about the televiewer with George being able to read the news on the television. About 35 years ago in Great Britain, we had something called CFAX, which was like a text-based news system that would be on a television channel. So I was able to read the news in a very rudimentary text-based form via my television. And that was, about 20 odd years after the show first came out in the early 1960s. So where the design might be quite clunky or rudimentary, it is fascinating to sort of think about just what are observations and ideas about the idea of seeing inside the human body, which is now something that is done very, very routinely and in incredible high definition imagery in our body's systems. That it's strange to think that these ideas were emanating for something that was designed for children, and so was literally, in a lot of cases, a throwaway gag. And that's quite instructive to us about where these great advances in technology that changes our perceptions about certain things can come from what would ostensibly be the most unlikely of places.
It comes from all over the place, and these ideas do come to happen almost the way they were depicted. One thing that would not be complete, one of the questions I get from some people that listen to this podcast is they actually have questions because they're into trivia, and there are some little trivia items that are associated with the Jetsons that people may not know. For one, the Jetsons theme song hit the Billboard charts in 1986. But we talked about innovations, and there was an innovation that, again, hits home with people that use computers these days. George had a computer, and it actually had a name. It was based on an acronym, and his computer was called RUDI, R-U-D-I.
Yes.
And that actually stood for Referential Universal Digital Indexer. Now, does that remind you of anything when we talk about George's computer and the way they kind of humanized that computer when it would talk to George in a human way?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is Alexa, the Amazon computer. I don't know if that's what you were thinking of, but I mean, certainly there are moments where you will say, Alexa, please put on a 15-minute timer, and you will say thank you. Which I find quite odd. I have to sort of stop myself and think I'm literally talking to a machine, but I'm extending it the courtesy that I would do a human being. The fact that you can do this with Siri is another one on Apple products. We are now becoming very, very fluent in the idea of conversing with computers. It's not a full conversation, but there is a backwards and forwards dynamic going on, which I think for someone of my age takes a bit of getting used to, but I think for younger people is just second nature.
You talk about those technologies like Alexa and Siri and all technology. When technology is developed and deployed, we often think that it's a time saver. And there's another piece of trivia for George Jetson. People may not realize it because we can see that George is always late for work.
Yes.
But he only starts his workday at 11 a.m. and it only goes until 3 p.m., presumably because technology has made the need to work an 8-hour day less, but he's still late for work. What does that say about the way we use technology and maybe the limits of technology?
I think that one of the great gags about the Jetsons, and indeed, its progenitor, the Flintstones, is that we can have access to all manner of technology, which informs our lives and makes things ostensibly easier. But the one thing that doesn't change is human nature and human fallibility. And I think that is something that's oddly comforting, because we have to accept that we might have a great deal of technology in our lives, but it can't fix our lives completely. It can make things more fluid. Our access to information is now huge, but some people might argue there's too much information. But that doesn't stop George Jetson from being lazy. It doesn't stop him from being tardy to meetings or getting to work. And I think that's one of the core messages about the Jetsons that I always found very comforting and enlightening, that society can change to a drastic degree, but humans often don't. And I always found that quite amusing, that technology it changes people's way they interact, but it doesn't actually change people intrinsically.
People will still be people.
Very much so. It's more than that. It's that you might look at the Jetsons and you might see a utopian vision of the future, which is certainly there when you look at all that gleaming architecture and the fact that technology is in abundance and allows us to do all these amazing things. But it's not a dystopia. It's certainly not dark. It's very, very optimistic in its presence. But I think one of the great things about the Jetsons, and one of the reasons that it survived beyond that small one-season run and got revived in the 1980s, is the fact that it's neither utopia or dystopia. It's a technology that's informing culture and moving it on, but we're still dealing with the same old things, the jobs that we don't like, a demanding spouse, the children who always want to have your attention and don't leave you alone. That's why it's so similar to the Jetsons, because whether Stone Age or whether Space Age, you're still dealing with the same old things. And I think there's a comfort to that. There's a sort of like an amusing inevitability to it. And I think people like that. If technology and society changed so drastically that you didn't recognize the world around you, that would be frightening. So the fact that people are still dealing with the same old things, no matter how much technology or lack of technology they have, it gives something for people to recognize and understand and place themselves in. And there's an innate sense of humor from thinking, well, you might have a machine that can help you get dressed in the morning, but I bet you still put on the wrong set of socks.
It's all about familiarity, isn't it?
I think so. I think that's why a big reason why the Jetsons hit home in popular culture. It was a small show that made a very big impact. And certainly now, because it's been 28 years since the Jetsons movie in 1990, and we now look back with nostalgia at something like the Jetsons, it becomes instructive about the ideas of technology that we were having at certain periods, whether it be the 60s or the 1980s. And certainly with regards to the latter, that's where we were seeing technology accelerating at a real degree of knots. So I think there's a wonderful nostalgia to it now.
Back in 2012, Matt Novak wrote an article in the Smithsonian.com, and he talked to you for that. But he made a comment himself, and he described the Jetsons as having a profound impact on the way that Americans think and talk about the future. And so now my question for you, Danny, is how do you think this simple cartoon will have a lasting impact on how we see the future from here?
I think it allows us to have a more nuanced perspective about how technology influences our lives, but actually reinforce an understanding that society does not change as fast as we might think. Certainly, if you look at cinema and certainly the Jetsons, we are presented with images and visions of the future that are startling in their difference to what we have now. And I think that when that journalist spoke about the profound impact of the Jetsons, he wasn't wrong. It was presenting us with a fundamentally optimistic vision of the future in which Americans and Americana was intact, but we had a more pleasing and empowering relationship with technology. And I think these days, in 2018, we can talk about how technology is affecting us in all manner of ways, good and not so good. But it's looking at the future about the values that we have and how they don't need to be altered over time. They stay the same, and technology allows us to live our lives in a better and more productive fashion. But behind all of that, the idea of the family, of our loved ones and being together and living life to the full is something that is at the heart of something like the Jetsons. The technology doesn't change the dynamics of the family. It just allows them to sort of go about their business and, engage with the world in different ways, but they're still, your classic nuclear family, as it were.
One final question, Danny, and this is kind of where the past met the future. And it was an episode where the Flintstones and the Jetsons actually met each other. What did that mean to you when you saw that?
Well, when that came out, I was 13 years old, and the Jetsons were propelled back in time thanks to a time machine created by Elroy, the son, and they wanted to go to the future to take a break in the 25th century, which I always thought was amusing in itself, of the idea of time travel as a holiday. But Astro accidentally knocks the controls back to the past, and they end up in the Stone Age, in Bedrock, where they get to meet their Stone Age counterparts, the Flintstones. And it reinforced those central tenets of what the Jetsons was, in as much as no matter where you were in history, Bedrock in the Stone Age or in the future, in the far-flung future of the 21st century, in 2060 odd, that those family dynamics never changed. The problems never changed. And I thought it was very, very amusing that, these two families could look at each other and the things that they depended on in terms of technology that looked quaint and, barbaric to one and absolutely magical to another. Fundamentally, they were the same. And I always thought that was very, very amusing, that they were better off in their own spaces. That's where they were most comfortable. But, some things would never change. And I think that there is a comfort to that.
Danny Graydon, thank you for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure, Tim. Nice to meet you.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a bio on our guest, Danny Graydon. You'll also find more information on his book, The Jetsons, the official guide to the cartoon classic, and you'll find links to other stories about the Jetsons. You can also listen to other episodes. We want to know what you think. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find at your favorite podcast channel. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.